Let us enliven our hearts and minds in gathering with the remembrance of the Holy Prophet and his purified progeny. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. One of God's greatest blessings upon us is that He has provided us with guidance to the truth. And in the Quran there is a prominent dua that we often recite, in which we say, Alhamdulillahi alladhi hadana lihada wa ma kunna linahtadiya lawla an hadana Allah. Praise be to God who has guided us to this truth. And had it not been for God's guidance, had it not been that God had provided this guidance for us, we would not have found guidance alone. And our reports and teachings tell us that God has gifted humanity with two forms or two means of guidance. One is guidance that is external to ourselves, and one is guidance that is internal. External guidance is represented by God sending prophets and messengers with revelations. Some traditions say that over the course of history, beginning with Adam and ending with our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam, Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa that God sent 124,000 prophets and messengers. And some of them were given revelations. And these act as external guides. God sends them in order to present us with guidance. And in the school of Ahlul Bayt, there is also, in addition to the prophets and messengers, there are also the Imams who have been appointed by God in order to protect this message and in order to further elaborate on the teachings in which God revealed to the Prophet. For the Imams are considered to be guardians of this revelation. And this is why the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him and his family, he says that Ali, he describes the place of Imam Ali. He says, Ali will fight for the ta'weel of the Quran just as I fought for its tanzeel. Ali will fight for the interpretation of the Quran, the safeguarding and interpretation of the Quran in the same way that I fought for its revelation. And this is a report that is found in the major books of hadith across the various schools of thought within Islam. And in fact, if we examine the place of Imam Ali in relation to the Prophet, we find that Imam Ali was the closest disciple of the Prophet. The Prophet had many disciples, but the closest in terms of the length of time that he spent with the Prophet. No one spent as much time with the Prophet as much as Ali. How is this? Because when we know historically that when Ali was a young boy, the Prophet brought him into his own home. He raised him himself from a young age. And Ali ibn Abi Talib, he notices this and he mentions this in Nahj al-Balagha, in sermon number 192. He says very beautifully, وَقَدْ عَلِمْتُمْ مَوْضِعِي مِنْ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَآلِهِ وَسَلَّمْ بِالْقَرَابَةِ الْقَرِيبَةِ. You know my special closeness that I had with the Messenger of God. وَالْمَنْزِلَةِ الْخَصِيصَةِ, very distinct position that I had with the Prophet. He says, وَضَعَنِي فِي حِجْرِهِ وَأَنَا وَلَدٌ يَضُمُّنِي إِلَى صَدْرِهِ. He took me into his home when I was a young boy, and he brought me close to his chest. He says, وأنا ولد يضمني إلى صدره ويكنفني في فراشه. He says, when I was a young boy, I used to sleep in the bed of the Prophet next to him. He used to allow me to sleep next to him. And he raised me. وَيُمِسُّنِي جَسَدَهُ وَيُشِمُّنِي عَرَفَهُ. He says, I was so close to him that he would often embrace me. And I could smell him. I knew the Prophet's scent. It was very distinct. And then he continues, and he says, وَلَقَدْ كُنْتُ أَتَّبِعَهُ اتِّبَاعَ الْفَصِيلِ أَثَرَ أُمِّهِ. I used to follow the Prophet just as a baby camel follows its mother. وَلَقَدْ كُنْتُ أَتَّبِعَهُ اتِّبَاعَ الْفَصِيلِ أَثَرَ أُمِّهِ يَرْفَعُ لِي فِي كُلِّ يَوْمٍ مِّنْ أَخْلَاقِهِ عَلَمًا. He would teach me every single day. He would raise me in my mannerisms. He would teach me what it means to live virtuously every single day. وَيَأْمُرُنِي بِالْإِقْتِدَاءِ بِهِ. And he would command me to follow him and to learn from him. Ali ibn Abi Talib, from a young age, from when he was a child, he accompanied the Prophet. The traditions, they tell us that when the Prophet first received his revelations, this was even before the Prophet received his revelations. He was still a young man. Ali grew up in the home of the Prophet and Khadija. It was not until 15 years after the Prophet married Khadija that he received his first revelation. 15 years. Throughout this time, Ali grew up with the Prophet. He followed him. He says, when the revelation first came upon the Prophet, it was just me and Khadija and the Prophet. It's just us three. We began. This is how it began. And he was with the Prophet. When the Prophet received his revelations, Ali was there. In another report, he says, عَلَّمَنِي رَسُولُ اللَّهِ أَلْفَ بَابٍ مِّنَ الْعِلْمِ يُفْتَحُ لِي مِنْ كُلِّ بَابٍ أَلْفَ بَابٍ. The Prophet taught me 1,000 doors of knowledge. From each would open up another 1,000 doors. There is no doubt, dear friends, just read history. There is no doubt that Ali was the closest disciple and student of the Prophet. And thus, he was in the school of Ahlul Bayt. We believe that he was the guardian of the revelation. He fought to protect the revelation. He elaborated, he interpreted, he taught. This was his function. And so here you have the external guide, who is represented by the Prophet, the Messenger, the divine guide, the Imam. And then you have an internal guide. And the internal guide, it is what is referred to as the intellect, al-aql. And the traditions, they tell us that God's very first creation was al-aql. In al-Kafi, if you look at one of the major sources of hadith in the school of Ahlul Bayt, al-Kafi, which was compiled by al-Kulayni, the very first chapter of this book of hadith is called Kitab al-Aqli wal-Jahl. The book of intellect and ignorance, or Kitabul Ilmi wal Jahl, the book of knowledge and ignorance. And there we find traditions that say, أَوَّلُ مَا خَلَقَ اللَّهُ الْعَقْلِ. The very first thing, entity that God created was the intellect. And then God conducted an experiment with this creation. An experiment of obedience. Will it obey God or not? And once the intellect, it passed, it obeyed, it passed this test, God then pointed to it and said, it is through you that I will use as a standard for human accountability. I will hold humans accountable through you. And by the way, even the prophets and the messengers were tested and chosen through various tests of obedience. It was not an arbitrary decision. God didn't just point at anyone and choose them to be a prophet or a messenger. They were tested with obedience. And this is why the Quran tells us very clearly, وَإِذِ ابْتَلَى إِبْرَاهِيمَ رَبُّهُ بِكَلِمَاتٍ فَأَتَمَّهُنْ. And when God tried Ibrahim with various tests, and he completed them, he fulfilled them. He passed the test. Then what happened? قَالَ إِنِّي جَاعِلُكَ لِلنَّاسِ إِمَامًا. I have now selected you as an imam, as a leader for people. You passed the test of obedience. These, if you look at the books of tafsir, this is after Ibrahim's greatest test, where he was tested with his son Ismail. God had commanded him, take your son and sacrifice your son. And Ibrahim passes this test. And then God says, إِنِّي جَاعِلُكَ لِلنَّاسِ إِمَامًا. I have selected you now, I have appointed you as an imam, as a leader. So even the prophets and the messengers, the divine guides, they were also tested with obedience. And it is for this reason that they were chosen as guides. So the prophets and the messengers are the external guides with their revelations. The divine guides, the anbiya, the rusul, the a'imma are the external guides, and the internal guide is the intellect, al-aql. Now, the question that we ought to examine now is, what exactly is the intellect? When we say al-aql, or the intellect, what are we talking about? Are we talking simply about our rational faculties, our mind, our ability to gather data or analyze data? Is this what is intended? Reason? When we take a closer look at our teachings, we find that al-aql, intellect, is distinct from reason. Reason is something else. Our rational mind, our ability to rationalize, to gather data, to analyze data, is not the intellect. The intellect refers to something else. The intellect we can conceive of and think of as a divinely programmed, intuitive mode of insight. A divinely programmed, intuitive mode of insight that contains, among other things, a moral and an aesthetic sensibility. This is how we can conceive of intellect, al-aql. And this is not the same as reason or the rational mind, which depends on empirical data and logic to come to conclusions. These are two different things. Unfortunately, sometimes, especially in our contemporary world, they get mixed up. Intellect, al-aql, and our ability to rationalize, reason, they get mixed up. They are used interchangeably. But if we take a deeper look at the traditions, we find that they are two distinct faculties. The intellect is one that is much broader. Yes, reason falls under this broader category, faculty of intellect, but they are not to be confused. They are not the same. Reason allows us to arrive at an indirect mental conception of transcendent realities. It's an indirect mental conception of transcendent realities. Whereas the intellect allows us to experience a direct contemplative vision of transcendent realities. One allows us to think of concepts indirectly as concepts, and the other allows us to experience transcendent realities through contemplative vision. Now, if this is a bit heavy, let's take an example in order to understand what this means. Imagine that you are trying to explain to someone who has never experienced love what love is. They've never experienced it. And you're trying to explain to them what love is. Can love be seen? Can it be touched? It's not. Right? It's an emotion, a state that cannot be gauged with empirical data. Yes, you can take someone to the hospital and you can give them sort of a brain scan and show them images of people they love and see brain wave activity. That can be gauged, right? But you cannot see or touch love. You cannot smell love. But we know that it exists. Those who have felt it, those who experience it, those who experience heartbreak after love also know that it exists. Maybe sometimes even more than those who don't experience heartbreak, right? So imagine trying to explain love to someone who has never experienced it versus actually experiencing the love. It's the very similar. This is the difference between reason and intellect. Let me give you another example. Imagine that you are trying to explain the function of a smartphone to someone who lived 100 years ago. What would you say? You would probably say that you can use the smartphone to communicate with others. So the person would think, they would use their reasoning and what access they have to empirical data to think, well, okay, then maybe a telephone or a telegram. This is how you communicate with others. Or a letter, right? And it's kind of similar. You send messages, you write messages, you place phone calls. It's kind of similar, but it's not the same. So the person would think, okay, a telephone and a telegram and a letter kind of combined together. You tell them that it is a way for you to find directions to where you're going. So they think, okay, what provides me with directions? A map. If I want to travel, I look at a map. Okay, so it's got a map with it as well, right? And you begin to try to explain the smartphone to someone who has never seen or experienced or has any understanding. They will use whatever empirical data they have, and they will use their logic and put things together to come up with a conception, an indirect mental conception of what a smartphone is. But they will never actually experience it. You have to hold the smartphone, you have to open it, you have to access it, you have to use it. You have to have a direct contemplative vision of the smartphone in order to truly appreciate and understand what it's about. And that is the difference between reason and intellect. So reason allows us to understand certain things, to have mental conceptions, even of transcendent realities, but it's indirect and it's only a mental conception. Whereas intellect is a vastly more superior tool, faculty, that allows us to have a direct contemplative vision of transcendent realities. And this is why Imam Hadi alayhi salam, he distinguishes between two concepts. In saying number 276, he distinguishes between al-mu'ayana and al-ru'ya. He says, ليست الرؤية كالمعاينة مع الأبصار. He says al-ru'ya, or what we can call intuition or discernment, this direct contemplative vision, discernment, intuition, without the need to reason. It's there, it's immediate, it's graspable, right? He says, ar-ru'ya, intuition or discernment, is not the same as a physical or visionary perception of something, seeing something with your eyes. Discernment and physical vision are not the same. Why? He says, فَقَدْ تَكْذِبُ الْعُيُونُ أَهْلَهَا وَلَا يَغُشُّ الْعَقْلُ مَنْ اسْتَنصَحَهُ. Very beautiful. He says, because sometimes your physical eyes can play tricks on you. They can deceive you. How many of us have been deceived by our physical eyesight before? Huh? Many of us. You assume something, right? If you turn off the lights, sometimes in your bedroom you start to see figures. You're being deceived, right? You'll notice, for instance, the mirage is a very beautiful example of this, right? What is the mirage? You presume this is an ancient kind of illusion, essentially. You assume that there is water in the distance, but this is just the reflection of the sun and the heat, right? And there are many, this is what magicians do. What do magicians do? They make a living off of deceiving your eyes. So our eyes, those things that we depend on so much, this physical sense, in order to make, to understand the world around us, sometimes our eyes, our physical sight deceives us. He says, but as for intuition and discernment that is gained from the intellect, وَلَا يَغُشُّ الْعَقْلُ مَنِ اسْتَنصَحَهُ, that the intellect does not deceive the one who counsels it. It's a much more powerful faculty. It's much more reliable. It doesn't deceive you. Now, through these two means of guidance, the external and the internal, we find that we are able to arrive at a true understanding and ability to fulfill our ultimate objective in life when we use these two forms of guidance. The revelation, scripture, the Quran says in Surah Al-Isra, which is chapter 17, verse 9, إِنَّ هَذَا الْقُرْآنَ يَهْدِي لِلَّتِي هِيَ أَقْوَمُ. This book, this revelation, it guides to that which is most upright. It's the best guide. إِنَّ هَذَا الْقُرْآنَ يَهْدِي لِلَّتِي هِيَ أَقْوَمُ. In Surah Al-Baqarah, the beginning of Surah Al-Baqarah, chapter 2, we recite, ألف لام ميم ذلك الكتاب لا ريب فيه هدى للمتقين. This book, this revelation, there is no doubt in it. There is no discrepancy in it. And it is هدى للمتقين, a guide to those who are God conscious. So this is the significance of revelation. And of course, there are many other verses in the Quran. And Imam Ali alayhi salam explains to us the significance of the intellect, the second internal means or forms of guidance. He explains its significance in saying number 38, which is advice to his son, Al-Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam. Among the things that he tells him, he says to him, إِنَّ أَغْنَى الْغِنَى الْعَقْلِ. He says, intellect is the richest of riches. It is the richest of riches. If you want to go out and you want to make investments, you want to increase your wealth, depending on who you ask, you'll be given various advice. Some people will tell you go into real estate. Some people will tell you buy cryptocurrency, which I don't think is a good idea at all. Right? Some people will give you other advice, right? They will tell you that the best way to increase your wealth is do X, Y, and Z. That's the best. You're going to make the most amount. Imam Ali gives us the best form of wealth, the most valuable form of wealth. He says the richest of all riches is the intellect. The richest of all riches. This is a reminder that he gives to his son, Al-Imam Al-Hasan. In another statement, a similar statement, saying number 54, Imam Ali says, لا غنى كالعقل. There is no wealth like intellect. And on the other hand, he says, there is no poverty like ignorance. You can be poor or impoverished when it comes to your financial state, but you can still be the richest of people if you have intellect. But if you don't have intellect, then it doesn't matter how much money you have. يَوْمَ لَا يَنْفَعُ مَالٌ وَلَا بَنُونَ إِلَّا مَنْ أَتَى اللَّهَ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ. This is what the Quran tells us. On that day, no amount of wealth will be of benefit except if you come before God with a pure heart. Doesn't matter what kind of money you have, what kind of investments you've made. So Imam Ali here reminds us, and there are various other statements. In one he says, الْعَقْلُ رَقِيٌّ إِلَىٰ عِلِّيِّينَ, that the intellect is a ladder to the greatest of heights. If you want to reach the best of the best. والتين والزيتون وطور سينين وهذا البلد الأمين لقد خلقنا الإنسان في أحسن تقويم. God has created the human being in the best of form and given us the chance to go up to the highest stations. How can we do that? Imam Ali says, one good tool is to use intellect, for it is a ladder to the highest of stations. In another statement he says, Al-aqlu khalilul mar. What is man's best friend? Not the dog. He says man's best friend is intellect, because it is most loyal to us. And it is that which allows us to arrive at our ultimate objective. So Imam Ali gives us the significance of intellect, and there are many other statements. This is just a small example of the significance of intellect. But for intellect to do its job, it must be preserved. It must be sustained. It must continuously be enhanced, and it must be safeguarded from corruption. This is the only way that it is able to do its job and to continue to guide us. So Imam Ali teaches us regarding the preservation and the safeguarding and strengthening of the intellect, al-aql, and also how to avoid its corruption. When it comes to strengthening and preserving the intellect, I include 3 points. There are many, but we don't have time, so I only include 3 points. Number 1, Imam Ali says, Al-aqlu an taqul ma ta'rif. Intellect, if you want to preserve it, then it is preserved through saying only that which you know. Only speaking that which you are aware of and that which you know. Nowadays, we find that everyone is an expert in everything, especially with ChatGPT. Right now, everyone has become an expert. If someone gets sick, suddenly everyone is an expert in medicine. I'm sure the physicians will agree. Right? Oh, take this medicine, do this, don't do that. Everyone becomes an expert in medical advice. Right? If it's about politics, everyone is an expert political commentator. They know exactly what's going on in the world, and they're ready to give their political commentary. Even religion, right? We feel that, if I have a basis in, the recitation of the Quran or maybe a few hadiths, then I'm automatically, or that if I'm able to rationalize and reason, then I'm automatically an expert. Imam Ali says sometimes if you do not know something, then don't speak about it. And this is exactly the message of the Quran, by the way. This is not different. The Quran says, وَلَا تَقْفُ مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٍ. Do not utter or speak that which you do not know. Don't speak about that which you do not know. وَلَا تَقْفُ مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٍ. Imam Ali reminds us that the most knowledgeable person is the one who is able to admit that he or she does not know something. He says in saying number 82 of Nahj al-Balagha, he says, do not be ashamed of saying, I don't know, if you don't know. This is difficult for us. And I say this especially for the brothers. Right? There's this idea that if men are asked about directions and they don't know, they'll still give directions, right? Or they won't ask, right? Because they don't want to admit that they don't know. Imam Ali says, never be ashamed. If you do not know something, never be ashamed to say, I do not know. And also, he completes this, he says, and do not be ashamed to go and learn that which you do not know. Say, I don't know. I can find out for you. I can look into it. I can learn, but I don't know. In saying number 85, he says, abandoning saying, I don't know, when you don't know, leads to your destruction. Leads to our destruction. Because again, there's responsibility. وَلَا تَخْفُ مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٍ إِنَّ السَّمْعَ وَالْبَصَرَ وَالْفُؤَادَ كُلُّ أُولَٰئِكَ كَانَ عَنْهُ مَسْئُولًا. God says, do not state that which you do not know, because you are responsible for what you say, what you speak. God will ask you, He will say, hey, Hadi, why did you say X, Y, and Z? You didn't know. Why did you claim to know something and you made a statement over which you had no idea about? So here, Imam Ali says, if you want to preserve the intellect, you don't want it to become corrupted, then speak only that which you know. This is number one. Number two, or B, let's say B. This is still number one. 1A and 1B. And he says, وَتَعْمَلُ بِمَا تَنْطِقُ بِهِ. And you observe and you perform that which you speak. Means you act upon that which you say. And again here, the Quran tells us very clearly, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا لِمَ تَقُولُونَ مَا لَا تَفْعَلُونَ. O you who believe, why do you not practice what you speak? كَبُرَ مَقْتًا عِنْدَ اللَّهِ أَن تَقُولُوا مَا لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. It is a grave thing, the Quran says, with God, that you do not practice what you preach. What do we call not practicing what you preach? What is it called? It's called hypocrisy and nifaq. And nifaq. So if I want to preserve my intellect, then I should practice what I preach. If I speak, again, to my children, to take a contemporary example, a practical example of this, if I speak to my children or my spouse or friends or others, and I'm encouraging them to do something, but I don't do it myself, this is a blatant act of hypocrisy. And what do? Here, I contribute to the corruption of aql, this intellect. I have tarnished it. There's a virus now that has taken hold of my intellect. So he says to preserve, number one, to preserve and safeguard the intellect, speak only that which you know and act upon that which you say. Number one. Number two, in saying number 71 of Nahj al-Balagha, he says, إِذَا تَمَّ الْعَقْلِ نَقَصَ الْكَلَامِ. He says a complete intellect, a fully safeguarded and preserved intellect, is evidenced by the decrease of speech. You speak less. This is good for introverts. It's bad news for me. Why is that? Why do you think? Because oftentimes, if we engage in talkative behavior, we're always just blurting out everything that comes to our mind, we risk making mistakes. The more we speak, the more we risk making mistakes, right? Whereas, if your approach to speaking is one that is reasoned, that you think carefully about that which you want to say, it's considered. It doesn't just come out. Whatever comes to my mind, comes out through my tongue, it is reasoned, it is contemplated, then what happens? Then it is much likely that what you say will be of value. So he says, the more one's intellect is preserved, the less they speak. You only speak when it is opportune to speak, not just for the sake of speaking. This is number 2. Number 3, he says, to preserve one's intellect, one should avoid what does not concern us. Not to be too curious, to use a polite word, where I want to interfere and meddle in everything, even those things that don't concern me. What did he say? What did she say? Did you see what our neighbors did? Did you see what the people down the street did? Meddling in people's affairs, things that don't concern me. But yet I still have to interfere. I still have to intervene. Imam Ali alayhi salam says one way to preserve intellect, al-aql, is not to engage in that which does not concern you. So these are some things that Imam Ali gives us advice on how to preserve and strengthen the intellect. Now, there are some things that also corrupt, they destroy or they weaken the intellect. And here I give you 2 examples also from the statements of Imam Ali. He says, number 1, to be ashamed of speaking the truth. You know the truth, you realize it, you understand it, and you have the opportunity to speak the truth, but you do not. Ashamed to speak the truth. What does this do? It corrupts our intellect. It weakens our intellect. Now, this is under normal circumstances. Sometimes you have a legitimate fear, right? There could be a fear for one's life, right? As an extreme kind of case. There could be a fear for one's property or family or health or safety. In those cases, no, of course. In those cases, you have to preserve your honor, your dignity, your life, your family, your safety. It has to be preserved. But under normal circumstances, if you have the opportunity to speak the truth, but you are ashamed or you refrain from speaking the truth, this does what? Negatively impacts the intellect. How many opportunities do we have to speak the truth? This is a question that, I have to ask myself, right? So number 1, things that corrupt or weaken the aql is to be ashamed to speak the truth. Number 2, he says self-admiration. Self-admiration destroys the intellect. In letter number 53 to Malik al-Ashtar, we were introduced a couple of nights to letter number 53. We come back again. I said it's the longest letter in Nahj al-Balagha. It's filled with wisdom. Letter number 53 by itself, you can spend a month every night speaking about. In the letter to Malik al-Ashtar, he states to him, he says, وَإِيَّاكَ وَالْإِعْجَابَ بِنَفْسِكَ. Malik, I caution you from self-admiration. Admiring yourself. Being proud of your accomplishments. Letting your accomplishments get to your head. Stand in the mirror and you say, MashaAllah. Huh? Look at this wall of mine with all of these degrees, all of these trophies, all of these acknowledgments. How wonderful I have done in the world. Allow these accomplishments to get to your head. You begin to admire yourself. He says, إِيَّاكَ وَالْإِعْجَابَ بِنَفْسِكَ. Be cautious from self-admiration. Why? فَإِنَّ ذَلِكَ مِنْ أَوْثَقِ فُرَصِ الشَّيْطَانِ. He says self-admiration is one of the biggest opportunities of Satan to come and to destroy you. Why? Because Satan loves self-admiration. He did it himself. Said, I'm better than him. He loves it. So Imam Ali says this is an opportune time for Satan to come and attack. This is one of his greatest tactics. Speaking of Satan's tactics, they say that one day a man, he fell asleep and he saw in his dream that he met Satan. Right? Wal-'iyadhu billah. He met Satan, and so this is, a once in a lifetime opportunity. He wants to ask him some questions. So he says, Satan, listen, I'm very curious. Can you show me your tools? Can you show me how you work? How is it that you are able to deceive people and misguide them? How do you draw them to you? So Satan says, my pleasure. He shows him, his garage, essentially, with all of his tools. And he begins to explain to him one by one. He says, you see, first here, I have this huge chain that is an anchor. You've seen the anchors of ships, how large the chain is, right? He says, this anchor I use to tie around those who are the most difficult to draw. I have to tie them with an anchor and pull them with all my strength. They're very difficult to draw. They're resistant. So this is the tool that I use for such individuals. Then he moved along and he said, you see this also large chain, but much smaller than the anchor. This is for those who are a little bit easier to draw. I don't need to exert as much effort. They're still tough, but it's a little bit easier. He went along, then he showed him a large rope. He said, this rope is for those who are a little bit easier to draw. I don't need to use a chain any longer. I use this rope. And then he went along, proceeding until he got to a small, thin piece of yarn. He said, and this one I use for those who are easiest. I just pull them with a piece of yarn. So the man was very curious. He turned to him, he said, I have a question. I said, what is it? He said, which of these tools do you use to draw me in? He said, oh, I just go like this and you come running to me. Amir al-Mu'mineen says one of Satan's greatest tactics is to attack us through self-admiration. When I think of myself in proud terms, when I let my accomplishments get to my head, and thus in saying number 454, Imam Ali alayhi salam, he says, مَا لِبْنِ آدَمَ وَالْفَخْرِ. He says, I'm surprised when the children of Adam express arrogance and pride. Why? He says, he describes the essence of the son of Adam, the children of Adam. He says, أَوَّلُهُ نُطْفَةٌ وَآخِرُهُ جِيفَةٌ. He says, I'm surprised at the children of Adam, why they are so proud and arrogant when their beginning is a sperm and their end is a corpse. Our beginning and end. And the Quran reminds us of this essence, our origin and our destination. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Taha, verse 55, He says, مِنْهَا خَلَقْنَاكُمْ وَفِيهَا نُعِيدُكُمْ وَمِنْهَا نُخْرِجُكُمْ تَارَةً أُخْرَى. God says it is from the earth that we created the human being, and it is to the earth that the human being will return, and it is from the earth once again that the human being will be resurrected. This is our origin and destination. The Quran says, وَلَا تَمْشِ فِي الْأَرْضِ مَرَحًا. Do not walk exultantly on the earth. إِنَّكَ لَن تَخْرِقَ الْأَرْضَ وَلَن تَبْلُغَ الْجِبَالَ طُولًا. You shall never pierce through, tear the earth, nor shall you reach the height of the mountains. Very beautiful. When you are arrogant, exhibit arrogance, it translates not just through your thoughts and emotions, but also translates into how you speak and how you walk and how you talk and how you interact. Sometimes you find that there is sort of an arrogant walk. There's a stomping on the earth. God says, this arrogant walk, what is it going to do to you? Are you going to be able to pierce through the earth? Or if you walk with your chest and chin up, will you ever be able to reach the height of the mountains? وَلَا تَمْشِ فِي الْأَرْضِ مَرَحًا إِنَّكَ لَن تَخْرِقَ الْأَرْضَ وَلَن تَبْلُغَ الْجِبَالَ طُولًا. The Quran reminds us, it is from the earth that you were created, and to the earth that you will go back and once again be resurrected. Reminding us again of this essence, our essence, which is our origin and our destination. And thus, it's important for us to think about how we can preserve this great gift of God. Again, you'll notice that intellect is not the same as reason. You can have rational mind. You can analyze data. You can have, quote unquote, knowledge, the accumulation of data, but you can still not have intellect. This is why so many, quote unquote, knowledgeable people, so many scholars, so many professors, so many scientists engage in all sorts of immoral behavior. Why? Because that intellect is corrupted. Again, the intellect is that faculty that includes a moral and an aesthetic sensibility. It's not just about the accumulation of knowledge that makes us able to use our intellect. The intellect is something very different. And thus it must be preserved. It must be strengthened. We must avoid corrupting it in order that it allows us, it works well, and it allows us to arrive. And we need the intellect, because it is with revelation and with the intellect together that we are able to proceed forward and to fully understand and to fulfill our obligations in this life. Amir al-Mu'mineen, in his final moments on his deathbed, and today is the day, the anniversary of the martyrdom, the Shahada of Amir al-Mu'mineen, on the 21st of the month of Ramadan. The reports, they say that on his deathbed, he continued to recite this verse that I just mentioned from Surah Taha, verse 55. مِنْهَا خَلَقْنَاكُمْ وَفِيهَا نُعِيدُكُمْ وَمِنْهَا نُخْرِجُكُمْ تَارَةً أُخْرَى. He continued to repeat it. From the earth we created you, and to the earth you will return, and from the earth once again you will be resurrected. And we find the greatest act of humility with Imam Ali alayhi salam, even when it came, let alone with orphans and those who were good, even when it came to his killer, Ibn Muljam. We find someone who deals in humility. Ibn Muljam is brought forth. He's tied. He struck Amir al-Mu'mineen in the masjid. He is captured. He is tied. He is brought forth before Amir al-Mu'mineen. While he's in this very difficult state, he looks up and he sees that Ibn Muljam is tied, and he turns to his sons, his family, those around, and he says to them, loosen his tie a little bit. Don't be so tough on him. He asks them, have you given him anything to eat or drink? This is the character of Amir al-Mu'mineen. This is because Amir al-Mu'mineen, Ali ibn Abi Talib, was the master of intellect. He was the embodiment of revelation, of what it taught. So we find that even these final moments, Imam Ali teaches us what it means to be humble, even before our enemies, even before those who wish us harm. And those final moments on the Imam's deathbed were difficult moments. You can imagine his family surrounding him, seeing their brave and courageous father. Ali, who would stand in the battlefield and people would run away. This man who was courageous and brave and strong and mighty, now laying on his deathbed in absolute weakness. His family is around him, they are surrounding him. He turns to his children one by one. You can imagine those final glances that they take, the final moments that he looks at his children and those around him, the final moments that the children see of their father. You can imagine Zainab standing by her father's side. Ah, Zainab, Ummul Masa'ib. She saw so many tragedies in her life. Zainab stands by the side of her beloved father, Amir al-Mu'mineen. You can imagine Kulthum. You can imagine Al-Hassan. You can imagine Al-Hussein surrounding their father. You can imagine Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas, a young man at the time. You can imagine Amir al-Mu'mineen calling Zainab and Abbas, telling them, my beloved Zainab and my beloved Abbas, come forward, come to me. You can imagine Imam Ali taking the hand of Zainab and taking the hand of Abbas and placing the hand of Zainab in the hand of Abbas, as if he's telling him, my dear son, don't let go of your sister's hand. Be with her. Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen. Had you placed the hand of Zainab in the hand of Abbas and you expected him never to let go of her hand, how would it have been possible for him to hold on to her hand when his own hands were cut on the day of Ashura? Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. وَسَيَعْلَمُ الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا أَيَّ مُنْقَلَبٍ يَنْقَلِبُونَ وَالْعَاقِبَةُ لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on this blessed and tragic day that He accepts our prayers, our supplications, our fasting, our acts of charity, our goodness, that He forgives our sins and our shortcomings. We ask Allah to grant us wisdom and insight and guidance, and to continue to guide us and our families and our children towards that which is good, that which pleases God, and away from that which is detrimental to us. We ask Allah to bring relief and comfort to those who are sick, those who are ill, those who are suffering around the world. Some people in our own community here and elsewhere have asked us to keep them in our prayers during these nights. We ask Allah to bring them relief and comfort. We ask Allah to honor us with the ziyarah of Amir al-Mu'mineen in this life, in His shafa'ah in the hereafter. We ask Allah to hasten the reappearance of our 12th Imam, Al-Hujjat ibn al-Hassan al-Mahdi. We ask Allah to bless the souls of all of the marhumeen. For all of their souls, let us recite Surah Al-Fatiha ma'a salat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.